Kim Schwenk, MLIS, is a rare book cataloger at UC San Diego Special Collections and Archives Library, and an antiquarian bookseller with ABA member Lux Mentis Booksellers. She has a subject specialization in North American and Latin American and European witchcraft, history, early printed occult texts, and cunning folk magic using plants and objects. That has got to be the coolest specialization ever. Thank you for being here, Kim.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. And before I get started, I want to do land acknowledgement. I am speaking to you from Kumeyaay unceded territory today, and I am a white female with dark hair and blue eyes for visually impaired folks. So again, I really love these brown bags, and I really appreciate the Gender Equity Initiative for putting these together, and for you for sharing your time. And musings is certainly something that I think this is going to be about. I really wanted this to be very informal, as opposed to normal librarian, boring slideshow stuff. I wanted to really have it, so I'm not speaking for so long, but really have it for this forum to share thoughts and comments about this particular topic. Yes, the introduction about myself formally, but I think a lot of my practice over the years has been informed by a lot of accountability building and punk ethics that I've learned. You know, yes, I'm a punk rock. I'm a punk rocker from the days, and those have steeped into the way that I have learned and unlearned and deconstructed things over my career. And certainly with accountability practices, praxis, having very much a foundation of using anarchism and anarchist principles, those direct actions, responses, and community building for sure. And, you know, someone might say, well, how can you're an anarchist, how can you work in a capital field? Well, I tend to value social capital very highly. And so this is one of the ways to do that, working in a business practice with commerce, is to build social capital. And so in thinking about that, and the fact that I do work, I have one foot in the field of the library world and have for a while, for 20 years, and working in special collections, but also then more recently in the bookselling world. And so it's a very sort of, as Jonathan Kearns put, this alchemical marriage between the two, having my love of bibliographic material and bibliographic description. So this is where that I'm at. And so I came up with this idea about this topic mainly because of what I've been doing in the library, specifically with cataloging, but also just my general sense about the trade and seeing how things are going and how they're evolving and stuff like that. And so I pitched this idea about inclusive cataloging. And I also recently I took a course on it from some lovely librarian friends that I know. And that really informed sort of me thinking about that. And so what I'm going to do here is, I swear I'm only have 5 slides. I'm not going to bore you with slides. So I'm going to share my screen and then do this. And then let's see, I need to play this. I'm not seeing the place where I can hit play.
Is it on the
I got it.
view?
I got it. Yeah. Does everyone see that? Okay, cool. All right. So let me just go up here. Do you see that closed captioning? Because I don't have a mouse function, so I don't know if that can be closed or not, but there's a little dialog box that says a participant has enabled closed captioning, which is fine. So if that doesn't bother anybody, I can't get rid of that. So anyway, sorry for the very boring slide, but really what this is about is the purpose of this is to understand inclusive cataloging, AKA am I calling it radical cataloging. And so what that is to utilize inclusive metadata. And it's a word we throw around in the library world, in the cataloging world a lot, practices both and initiatives. And so before I start, I'm just going to say what I'm not going to do. And the first is really talk about problematic semantics. I think that call out culture is not useful or helpful in the long term. And so in thinking about that, when we get wrapped around the axle and talking about terminology, sometimes that's not very helpful, because really it's about applying things that are useful and helpful in terms of description and or community building and things like that. The second thing I'm not going to do or say is I'm a baby cataloger and I am not the authority on this. And I want to say a comment about privilege in this field, both in the cataloging world and in book selling worlds. We carry a lot of enormous amount of privileges in terms of class and race. And so acknowledging that, I think, as a first step, that I am not the authority on this. And when in doubt, I refer to persons, communities, and things like that. The last thing I'm not going to do is talk a lot about apology discourse. Again, I'm sort of throwing out terms, but this idea of this is how it's been done for a long time, and I'm not going to change how I do this. Okay, that's fine. But like most things they involved, if this is something that you don't want to do with your practice or your trade, that's fine. But just remember, things are evolving, things are changing, and language is evolving and changing as well, and the way that we represent people and share in that discourse. So, whoops, oh, I can't advance my slide. There we go. Okay, perfect. So this lovely word cloud here was done by a friend of mine, Violet Fox, in a course that I took, an inclusive catalog, and I really like it because it's sort of bold and it, has all these terms, but all of these terms really describe what is going on in the library world, in the cataloging world, particularly with, for me, special collections, so rare materials, but also in Library of Congress in general. And so what all these terms are referring to are what is radical cataloging. Well, this is referring and addressing root, systematic, or structured issues behind social problems. And so radical cataloging as a term in this way refers to that, but is not an attempt to necessarily do away with or subvert cataloging in general. It's just to address certain root issues, to address the way that we access information and we discover information that can be problematic. And so the Library of Congress subject headings have been challenged for a long time by folks like Dorothy Porter, Sanford Berman, and a multitude of others throughout time to really look at these terms and how their level of offensiveness and at sort of accuracy and description, and how things have changed in society. But because there's a lot of bureaucracy, to say the least, in Library of Congress, there is a lot of hoops that have to be jumped through in order to get these terms to be changed. For example, one recently is the subject term, the subject heading of illegal aliens. And folks have worked really hard to get that to be changed. But what ended up happening is, as the term got changed to non-citizen, but also illegal citizens or illegal immigrants, rather. So there's still problems with a lot of this terminology. And I'm going to link on my next slide to a few pages about that, but you can read about this. And so this history of colonizing language, and when I say colonizing, I mean the way that it was done back then, this history of the way people were described in the history of language is still in use, particularly with terms like American Indians, Indians, treatment of, and Indians of North America. There's a lot of blanket general statements about certain communities that are still being utilized today. So that's one area where Library of Congress is sort of dismantling some terms and subject headings for me. As a subject heading nerd, I find them particularly useful, particularly in special collections materials. But in addition to that, in addition to subject headings, there's also working groups on demographics, term aggregation. And so like applying terms like Black authors, African-American authors in that metadata. And it's basically robust to get people for users to discover those records and discover that information. And so why is this important? Well, because language is power. I once worked on a collection of a Chicano activist, Herman Baca, and he said that in order for Chicanos to have power, you have to have the seat at the table, specifically politically. But it really impacted me because I knew what he was talking about. It's like that accountability to have people have a stake, have a place at the table, and to be seen as such. And so in the library world, the digital environment in the catalog is key, and its cataloging is extremely important because this is how information is not only described, but it's how it's discovered, how it's aggregated, you know, how that information is pulled together. And so the data from that culminated displays the discovery. And so that's why, you know, it's a huge system, as you all know. And so how you choose that language to use it really boils down to how mindful you are, you know, what's your discourse, how considerate you are. And you know, it really encourages collaboration with your colleagues, but also respect to your clients, and also your visitors to your booths. And this is specifically now in the book trade, when people come in, how they read your information, how it's described. Libraries follow a very strict code of authority control with these terms, right? And so we follow schemas. But in the book trade, we have, you know, a huge liberty about how we use language. And so adhering to professional ethics of the ABA, we have this opportunity here, this rich, robust language that we can use that sort of isn't subjugated necessarily by subject terms, for example, that we have available to be able to use. So, you know, again, just because we have this at our fingertips doesn't mean we need to use this. And so some of the things that I have been thinking about is, how do people describe themselves? You know, how would we describe them, and how would they want to be described? Now, certainly, you know, I can hear people saying, well, what if they're, it's you're dealing with information or a history of someone who's lived. That's where resources come in, period. And so taking those considerations, and we do this in the library world, you use specific cited sources, that bibliographies. And I was going to post in the comments a link to a great resource of bibliographies, specifically African-American bibliographies for people to look at. But that's something else to consider. Not only are your sources available, are your descriptions available, are those sources readily available? And so one of the things that's also particularly huge for me is that when you are describing someone who is in reaffirmation surgeries, they're changing their gender identification. Are you looking at their history, or what about someone's gender identity that you may want to expose? Is there a consent for that? Well, it's hard to do that when someone has passed on, certainly, but you go to the families, you go to how people would want to be described, and it's specifically hard when folks, it's evolving for this person, but you really have to take in consideration the identity of that person in the now. And so is that relevant then for your clients? How much information do you want to put in your descriptions? for people. And I will tell you that, you know, as a cataloger too, it's, you know, the wealth of, and I'll get into this in a little bit, the wealth of information presented to me from booksellers descriptions are invaluable. And so also that really helps inform catalogs too. So moving on. As promised, here is an example of a university who has taken on, and this is like a guide here for inclusion and description justice for collection development and or cataloging. And so I know it's hard to see that, and you can't really link from this, but at the bottom, I can copy and paste that link so that you have access to this finder here. And I think that the work being done as an initiative in the library world is really useful to help the book selling world. Some of the things that, and I'm going to get more specific here. So I have a subject specialty in the occult, broadly speaking. But what I've discovered in the last, I'd say probably about, you know, I've been only working for about 6 years in the book trade, but what I have really tried to focus on is finding material that is authored or created by BIPOC, by Black, Indigenous, people of color. But also if you have a topic of ethnographics, that material, say, for example, you have a book on African witchcraft, having those books be authored by scholars of color. And so that's one of the areas particularly, and that could mean language as well. And so I do a lot of cataloging in Spanish and non-English languages. So in practice, you know, I really adhere to transliteration and using diacritics. So in your author fields, having included those in your descriptions is very, very important. And sort of transcribing a language as it is, as it appears. But also, because I do a lot of translations, I try to include both languages in my descriptions as well. So if you have a title that is, you see it appear mostly in English, I actually translate it into the Spanish. Another thing that I do, and this goes back to what I was talking about, this is gender equity, is use people's chosen names and be as current as possible, because people, if that is the name that they have chosen at this point, when I mean by chosen name, that is the name that they have given themselves. Maybe they've had an affirming surgery. That's the name that they would like to use. Because again, it's this privacy issue, and it's also this inclusive issue about identifying people as the name that they want to be used and the gender that they want to be used, and talking about it in your descriptions. Another thing that libraries are doing is using Indigenous sovereign nations, Indigenous names of the community of the band whenever possible, rather than having blanket statements about Native Americans. So really researching and get deep into the fact that you are looking at materials made by Lakota specifically, instead of sort of saying Native American. That involves possibly reaching out to tribal leaders, the tribal community, to help you and to use those resources there. And sort of on that note, you know, when speaking about Indigenous people, I think this is really important to talk about with your materials, talk about Indigenous folks in the present rather than talking about people in the past tense, because if you have materials by Cherokee, these are not a dead people. So really keeping mindful acknowledgement in the present is particularly important when when using descriptions, and sometimes your local applied vocabularies. I mean, we have this open forum for description here that libraries necessarily don't have the resource to do, but it's important for context where, for example, a subject heading in the Library of Congress is too burdensome. So creation of those local identities for Indigenous people, you have this sort of world at your hands here. I'm going to give you a specific example of one of the records. This isn't a complete record here, and I pulled it out for some of the context statements in the description here. I was very taken with the story of these two sisters, conjoined twins, the McCoys, and I don't really, particularly do a lot of photographic material, and specifically photographic material of people of color, but I was very taken with their story and the adversities that they went up against to be seen, to be amplified, and share their experience. And so I apply this when I do pretty much everything that I write about, and that is context, 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 particularly when you, as a white bookseller, I'm acknowledging my whiteness here, context is very important. And source material, citing your sources. And so Kate Midas talked about this, and I really appreciate that she said this. When you are deferring to your scholarship, there's a lot of assumption out there, and look to your sources. But particularly for me, when I am writing about people of color, I look to the sources written by people of color. And so in this case, when I was speaking about the sisters, I went to a really great essay at the Museum of African American History to gather some of the information about them. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about is, in this description, there's a lot of terminology that comes up, and that is very, very useful when it comes to selling to institutions, because academic libraries want to find intersectional material, not only for collecting purposes, but for teaching purposes. It goes very far to have these terms and to have these descriptions when you're trying to place materials with libraries and librarians. It also informs subject headings. Again, I'm going to go back to this because I know this because I'm a cataloger. And so having these summary notes, I'm going to call you out. Ben Kenmont, really, his descriptions when they comment are super useful because they put things in a lot of context, but it also gives way to the creation of a lot of good subject headings. Lauren Baer, Bolerian Books, Kate Midas, a lot of these people have these descriptions where, they're really beautiful because they give pause to that history, but also the formation for a cataloger to put appropriate subject headings in when you are trying to conform to the system that you don't necessarily have in the book trade. And so I can't emphasize that enough. You don't think that your descriptions are important, booksellers? Well, they are. And a lot of times those get literally taken out and plopped into a record. And so I really, really appreciate that on sort of both sides of the aisle. And so one thing that I'm going to get into here in a minute, I'm sort of my last slide, is the spaces in your inventory about having material, collecting material that is created by and or features Black and brown people. And so one of the things in here that I mentioned is the fact that the context of the McCoy sisters really opens this idea of what is performance, what is the Black female body. And so trying to understand that in this sort of gaze of adversity here, this sort of white gaze of looking upon these two sisters, you know, what does that say about the history of theater performance, of Black performers, and so an African-American figures in history? You know, what is that saying about when we have these materials as white booksellers? Again, I may say something that people are going to go, you may disagree with me, but I really don't care. But no, but I do. I seriously, but I really want this dialogue to start happening. And so I want to talk about and end with talking about inclusive spaces. And that includes not only your cataloging space, your catalogs. So these are your bibliographic spaces, but also your physical spaces. And it includes your catalogs as well. You bring people in, you have a physical materiality here of your catalogs. And so that cataloging, that equity-centered cataloging that I've just sort of briefly glazed over, and your inventory development really informs your space that you set up at a fair, that you feature it in a catalog. And so how is your booth set up? How are your catalog design really make a difference, not just for BIPOC, but also for visually impaired, also disabled people, and things like that. And so that really, it's a holistic thing here that we're trying to work through. And so I know this has come up recently, and I think it was Molly Schwartzberg, who's now at Harvard, talked about the fact that if you are going to develop African-American materials, but the only thing that you're presenting are slave narratives, enslaved people narratives, you really want to think about how you're describing that in context of representation of African-American identities, Black people's narratives specifically. Again, don't assume anything about anyone. When they come into your space, there's acknowledgement is huge. I am not going to name this librarian, but I was very much floored from her experience at the London Book Fair, where she was not acknowledged as a Black woman at all. Very few people acknowledged her. You don't know who she is, you know. I think that speaks volumes, and it really affected me because that is part of my practice there. I'm not going to call anybody out. It's not useful, but I feel that when people come into your space, you really should make a point of acknowledging people just very briefly. And that, you know, people can sort of add on to that if you want. This also speaks about how your social media posts are too. When you feature images of Black and brown people in your social media posts. I know that Brooke from Camp Books does an excellent job of using description for visually impaired folks, identifying what the image is about. And that's sort of an example of that. And again, this sort of pyramid that I'm showing up, this is something I learned over the years in doing sort of, you know, hanging out with punks, hanging out with anarchists. The acknowledgement goes a long way, but allyship is the first step in this. We talk a lot about being an ally as a white person in activism, but standing with individuals or in a group in marginalized communities is a start. And this next level of being an accomplice, focus on dismantling these structures, sort of that are oppressing individuals and communities. And so that work really addresses the stakeholders in that marginalized group. And so there's a lot of terminology I'm throwing out here, but really it kind of boils down to a lot of performative acts that happen in spaces are not equity. They're not social equity. So acting on this and you know, we can get wrapped up in this, and maybe this is something that will develop in further and having more sort of direct workshops and things like that. But, you know, folks, it sort of really comes down to decency. Again, you know, to each their own and how you want to operate your business. But if you think about it, if you, in your booth, you have a lot of imagery or materials by Black and brown people, but you don't have a context of materials. Think about it as if an indigenous person walked into your booth and saw all these images of their ancestors, and you had, you know, little to no description about it. You are basically exhibiting people of color on display. And so there's sort of an exhibition about this that it's sort of problematic. And so getting your head wrapped around being decent and humanize people is a good start. People need to be acknowledged. And so look around at your material and see what you're offering, see how you're describing it. I think that this is a work in progress. I'm not denying that there's not a lot that can be done, but there's certainly more that we can do to get up to this level where we're all sort of having a seat at the table. And that's really what I wanted to start with here. And I'm very much interested in hearing what people have to say, not listening to me talk anymore, and you know, see where we can go from here. So I will stop sharing now, if I can. Okay. All right, folks.
Yeah, it's time for you to you should now be able to unmute yourself. So if you would like to unmute and ask him a question out loud, you're welcome to do so. If you feel more comfortable putting a question in the chat that you would like a question or a comment, you know, I think a dialogue is also totally wonderful. So
yeah, you can say, you know, you could, you know, if you want to criticize what I'm saying, that's fine too. I mean, I'm certainly, you know, looking at this in terms of like myself too as an individual, and how I conduct myself in business and practice and my relationships with, you know, because we look at our spaces and we look at our clients and we look at the people that attend book fairs, and you're looking around and you go, yeah, I mean, there's definitely an inequity there in terms of representation, in terms of class. I mean, it's huge with me. You know, I've always felt the book trade, you know, has a long way to not only, you know, make it spaces where people feel like comfortable and safe in, but also a place where people feel that they can develop their bibliographical sense. You know, they need to have a place at the table for that. And that could be in terms of financial constraints and things like that. It's always been a big issue with me, making things affordable. Oh, Ben Kinmont says that he cannot unmute. The host is not allowing. Is that me?
Can you?
Now it works, yeah. So
okay.
now it's permitting me to do it. Thanks a lot, Kim. This is really great. I think it could go on for hours. There's so much to talk about. One super practical thing that I've always found really difficult with the fair in terms of accessibility, I have a son in a power wheelchair, and so I'm always conscious of spaces to move around. And one of the really difficult things has always been, you know, I always think about what he can see from his chair. And the vitrines, you know, so I always tend to have my top shelf lower than most people, but it's also expensive real estate. So it's hard to start everything at like, you know, 3.5 feet off the ground and nothing above. So, but that's definitely an issue that I always think about, is a lot of the booths are, you know, a wheelchair really, you know, you need probably, you know, comfortably 30 inches to get a chair in and out. And then if the chair needs to be able to rotate, you know, you usually need a 5-foot diameter for a chair to rotate around, depending upon the size of the person in their chair. And so that's always I found to be a difficult thing too, is for folks in wheelchairs who are coming into the fairs, and being conscious of, you know, when to, you know, making it clear that you're willing, you know, you're there to hand things to them and that sort of thing, is I find really important at book fairs. But it's something I struggle with because of just the shelf height.
Yeah. And so, yeah, absolutely. And I think about that too, as far as visualization. You know, there are some sort of hack that you might be able to do in shortcuts, in that you have, you know, your printed catalog you could hand someone, if they're able to see that,
Yeah.
and also have, you know, and this again depends on how much equity you have, or how much resource you have to put in something like this. Like, you have a video screen, you know, of at the front that has some of your materials. But again, you know, that depends on how much, you know, time and effort and resource you want to put into something like that. But yeah, I mean, we've certainly had folks in wheelchairs come to our space, you know, and it's a little bit of maneuvering. At the same time, like, you know, you do it, and like you said,
Yeah.
you be available to bring something to someone, you know. And another issue that we've run into is, we have a lot of suggestive, you know, sexually explicit material. Do you put that at, you know, hype level for children to see? I've actually talked to parents or their chaperones, and said, we have some material that you know, you may find inappropriate for your kids. I'm just telling you that they're here. So, you know, that just, you know, again, it's this idea of like approach, acknowledgement. You know, you don't have to be overbearing and rude. You know,
Yeah.
it's that fine line, that dance between being, you know, helpful, but not being sort of overbearing to someone who just wants to browse too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
We have two comments in the chat. Lizzie Young said she'd be interested in more information about cataloging for those with sight impairments. So Kim, if you have resources, or if anyone else who's joined us today has resources, and if you want to throw those in the chat, that would be wonderful. And
yeah,
did you want to say something on that? Okay, cool.
I do know. I'm trying to remember, when I was in library school, this was a visual, it was sort of, there was a lot of software that was being developed for that. I am not a tech person, but I know I can definitely find some resources for that, because I know that there are libraries working on that. And I know I've seen a few librarians in here that I know, if they have also some links to that. So working with, because certainly public libraries are, you know, far ahead of a lot of universities on doing this, making materials accessible for the visually impaired, for sure.
Ann Myers had a comment. Thank you for your presentation, Kim. As a fellow rare books cataloger, I just want to underscore your point about how helpful book dealer descriptions are for catalogers. As you said, they can help inform our subject headings, as well as help us provide additional context in the catalog records. We catalogers can't be experts in everything, so having access to additional research is invaluable.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful thing, and I don't mind, you know, getting a very long, extensive record, you know, and at the same time, I know that there are some quota restraints for certain special collections to be able to churn out their cataloging statistics. They can't spend a lot of time. But again, having maybe this keywords in there is very invaluable for catalogers. At the same time, you know, the perhaps a bibliography citation, you know, because that gets put into what's called a 510, which is a note. And so if that is something that you can pop into a record, that even helps the wider research and user community in the library too. So you know, I can't impress the work that, you know, booksellers can do, should you choose to, is really important in the whole demographic of the library world. You know, you're not just selling stuff. And that's what you, and again, if commerce is your number one thing, I'm not going to, I have no shame in talking about that. At the same time, there is opportunity to be a part of scholarship here. And it's always something that for me is important, but not everybody has that as their impetus in this world. And I get that. But, you know, again, I can't impress enough. And I'll say it again, if you are a white dealer and you're dealing with BIPOC material, you really need to think a lot long and harder about how you're presenting that within words, description, narratives, but also presentation on the floor. I mean, you know, some people are not going to come into a booth and necessarily, you know, call you out. At the same time, they'll remember that, you know, and this librarian's experience that I recollected, she's going to remember that. You know, librarians pay attention, folks. They do. They'll remember things. So those first initial contacts are really important. Anyone else?
Yeah, Kate, can you unmute? There we go.
Okay, so this is, I don't know, I've been trying to formulate this question while you've been talking because, and you kind of just touched on it, Kim, but I feel like there's a pretty big gap between where the book selling world is at, the trade, and where the librarian world is at in terms of dealing with these kinds of issues. Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, partly that's just an age thing. There's a lot more older booksellers and a lot more like newer, younger librarians coming in who have different ideas. And so maybe it's just kind of a matter of time. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts about, aside from, I mean, the ABA did the diversity initiative did some guidelines, you're doing this talk, but like other than sort of leading by example, is there any other way that you can think of to kind of help bridge that gap and make it so that people aren't on the defensive, but so that they understand, like, so that librarians like this librarian you're talking about don't have to go public and say, this is what happened to me. Like that's mm-hmm. That's a horrible thing to not only have somebody go through that, but then have to like feel obligated to say something about it in order to, mm-hmm. to try to get some change to happen. And so how better can we do, what can we do better, to both make inclusive spaces and also lead the way for some of our colleagues who are more resistant to this?
Well, you know, a lot of ethical decision making can, you know, when you have a hierarchical system, it comes from the top. So if, you know, ABA makes statements about this, that's something. I think reaching out individually too helps. You know, I think it's a lot of direct action on individuals' parts because, you know, like I said, some folks, it's not like they're not going to be resistant to change. It's just they're not going to do it. And, you know, generationally, you know, that may be how it's going to evolve over time as like you said, the library world may not catch up to the book selling world. And it may be a lot slower. I mean, I'm open to suggestion, but I think that, you know, it really has to come from and maybe that there is somehow collecting ideas and maybe a working space for people that want to become involved and putting up some of these resources. You know, certainly there are courses or discussion groups that you can take on what's called microaggressions, sort of dismantling microaggressions. And what that is simply that when a person of color walks into your booth, you're not all of a sudden subjecting your own sort of micro subjective analysis about how you should be and interact with this person, or assuming stuff about someone who identifies as trans or things like that. I mean, collectively, I think we can come up with some, not necessarily guidelines, because that sounds so stiff to me. It's almost like we need to have a mantra without being too new agey about what are some of the things that you can do, and maybe share a resource like that, and have at each book fair, have some things maybe to hand out, or have it be mindful about the sessions that are at the fairs if we're going to, have more programming and things like that. But I think within the group, within ABA, maybe we can collectively share some resources and pull together. I don't want to add more work to folks, but I mean, if you start to do this, it becomes more natural so that you're not thinking about it. You just do it, and coming up with the idea, speaking about it, but then actually applying it in the practice. And it becomes very natural in your language too. And your behavior. I mean, that's really what it's about. It's like decency. It's what, equity equals decency, and inclusiveness is really about humanism. That's been my practice for a long time. Anyone else, please. Again, I want to say this too. It is not the job of folks of color to inform or teach white people about how to do things. Okay. So, really, I'm speaking here as a white person to other white booksellers about this. We need to do the work. We don't need to rely on people of color to inform us of how to do it. And so that right there, what you're talking about, Kate, is like, we need to get together then, and work collaboratively on that. Anybody else?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to hog this, but I have so many questions and things to share. So I'm sorry to jump in. And this one actually specifically, Kim, deals with anarchist groups. Mm-hmm. So I thought it would be a good question for you. I know that a lot of early, and it has to do with the politics around authorship identification, which is very loaded. And not only in terms of names changing, but also just in terms of if it's a collaborative group, but maybe only one person within the group becomes very famous later on, and how the narrative is written about that material. And then also that, for example, there's some, as I think I've mentioned, I'm doing a bunch of research on the San Francisco diggers right now, and the politics around some of the diggers most of the diggers in the beginning were very clear on being anonymous, and they didn't sign their documents. And yet in narratives later, some of them have been interviewed and taken identity, have identified themselves as authors, whereas others within the group haven't, and are quite angry. And the group is kind of splintered around these issues and so on. And I find this really fascinating because the whole politics of authorship and consumption of the idea of the author and value of a given piece of material because of the author and how the author is identified. Sometimes you can make something as a dealer more valuable to emphasize one particular person within the collaborative group. And yet, in fact, it was a co-authored document. And so this is a very complicated issue that's really hard to deal with. And I think about it all the times when just trying to write the basic description of a given item. How do I, just the layout, the heading, how do I identify this relationship and so on? And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
So first I'm going to say infighting and anarchist groups. I don't know what you're talking about. It's definitely some things. I know the Interference Archive, Josh McAfee has addressed this issue a lot in writing about anarchist groups. So he's a really good resource to think about that. One of the things that I went to this talk a long time ago was talking about the IRA and how some of the names of folks put them out there and their safety and their families. And so what kind of information at some point in history do you reveal about someone's identity, in time? Is it important? So that comment I made about what is important for your clients, in the library world, you may want to put in that person's name to not only, sort of enrich your description, but also they might then be given a subject heading or what's called an authorized name heading. So that might be kind of important. At the same time, you really have to think about privacy too, in this world of non-privacy and things being sort of open and open access. You know, I mean, it's a hard call. If someone has been explicit in literature about not wanting to reveal their anonymity, I would kind of respect that in sort of the present, personally. And if they're still living, you know, there's always an opportunity to contact them, or what is, in recent interviews, how are they identifying themselves? I mean, all you can do is going by what is of the now at a certain point, and that could change. You know, I mean, it's always going to be an evolving process. But as information gets instilled in the interwebs for posterity purposes, you know, that is potentially harmful to someone. And think about that if it does get put into like a catalog record, you know. But, you know, I certainly have not had to address that, particularly just with folks that have gender identity reveal as what I've had to mostly address. Folks that have changed their names to their chosen names, and rather respect that of the now rather than the name that they were previously their birth name. So, and that is more with contemporary materials for sure. So I think Josh may be a good person to contact at the Interference Archive.
Any final thoughts, questions, comments, praises?
Yeah, Ben has a comment. Another way to think about this: we are active participants in cultural production as booksellers. Yeah, absolutely. We make decisions about directions for sure. That's what I was talking about, the posterity of language. You know, it's evolving, but it also has a huge impact on, you know, the way that people, you know, because whether you like it or not, you know, people make impressions about you when they come into the floor of a show. You know, they'll take that with them when they leave.
Someone recommended the book Knowledge Justice by MIT, from MIT Press, edited by Sophia Lang and Jorge R. Lopez McKnight. And there's a link to that in the chat too. So if you're looking for good resources, that one comes recommended.
Yeah, and I dropped. I dropped one in at the beginning. It was on Archives for Black Lives, and this is something that when I did a cataloging project about a year and a half ago, with the Steve Turner materials, which was Black Americana, and it was really useful to use when writing summary statements about people, to have a resource about how to describe Black Americans, particularly with time sensitivity, but also the language that you choose to use. And that is in that link. And then I'd also dropped in the guide from UPenn about diversity, inclusion, cataloging, and collection development. That's huge.
Wonderful. Oh yeah, Kate, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know if I should even, that was such a nice way to end, but I was just going to mention something that Ben kind of reminded me of is when somebody who is in a wheelchair, a friend of mine, once told me that the best way to deal with them is like, don't assume anything, just ask if you can help. And that gives them the agency. And I think that kind of applies to anyone who comes in the booth. Like, if you just give them the agency to choose what they're looking for, how they want to be dealt with, that alone can sort of bridge a lot of these gaps sometimes. So that's all.
Yeah. Cultural agency is huge. I mean, it's, you know, you can always extend that acknowledgement, and that goes beyond, you know, on the floor at a show. You know, you get in swath of material from Indigenous people, First Nations. You know, the first place I would go to would be that identification of that tribal band, you know, right there. to figure out how can I repatriate this. I mean, I've run into issues where I had some. I had some material that came out I was really uncomfortable with because it was of a young Black woman in Los Angeles, and it made me uncomfortable, but that's good because it really made me realize, like, I am describing Black bodies, Black identity here, and it sort of made me uncomfortable. It's a good thing, you know, to question that and the kind of inventory that you want to have, you know, and you know, again, how if you are not able to really value this material and context for what it is, you have what's called, you know, racist Americana, blackface, things like that. If you know, then you need to think about how you want to represent yourself as a dealer when having that material and having it juxtaposed with the fact you have other African American material, you know, especially in your booth. So I'm hearing cars. Somebody else, Michelle. Oh, thank you, Michelle. Michelle is very lovely. Yeah, that's great.
This is wonderful.
A list of research.
Yeah, and I was just thinking something that I can do since you all had to register for this event is I will compile these resources that people have shared and send the links over just in like a follow-up email to the registration. And
all our spare time, you know, we can, like Kate, you know, we can pull together some of these things and have maybe a working document if people want to think about language and stuff like that. You know, again, it's what you want to put into it. You know, what kind of work that you want to put. And I know this has been brought up in talks before. We got to do the work and have it applied. You know, we can't just talk about it. And so get into that next level. Being an accomplice, being a co-conspirator there, standing with the stakeholders and your clients and things like that.
What a wonderful
I appreciate it. Yeah, I appreciate everybody. Thank you so much for hosting this. And please don't don't be afraid to talk to me at a fair or email anything about this issue. I swear I won't be mean.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. Thank you all for being here. Okay. You're welcome to unmute, turn your camera on, give a little clap or hello, and we'll see you next month for the next brown bag.
Thank you.